Tonight, we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay. Somewhere in the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in a land the ancients called Sumer, scribes sat in temple complexes that rose like stepped mountains against the Mesopotamian sky, and they recorded stories so old that even they considered them ancient. Tales of an age before humanity walked the earth, before the first city was built, before the first field was plowed, when beings they called the Anunnaki descended from the heavens to a young and wild planet, and these scribes pressed their reed styluses into soft clay tablets with the kind of careful devotion that suggested they believed every word they wrote, leaving behind for us a record so strange and so detailed that scholars have debated its meaning for over a century. And tonight, as you settle into your blankets and feel the weight of the day beginning to lift from your shoulders, we're going to explore these impossible accounts together, not rushing, not demanding anything of your tired mind, just drifting through the oldest stories ever told about the time before time. And I should warn you, if you're hoping for a quick summary or a simple explanation, you probably won't survive this, because these ancient accounts are layered and mysterious and wonderfully strange, filled with names that sound like wind through reeds and concepts that bend the modern mind in unexpected directions. And that's exactly what makes them perfect for a night like tonight, when your only job is to let go and float along on the current of ancient words. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching from somewhere interesting tonight, maybe drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there, because I love imagining this community scattered across the globe, all of us drifting towards sleep together, connected by these ancient stories. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The temple complexes of ancient Sumer, particularly those at Nippur, Eridu, and Ur, housed vast libraries of clay tablets, and archaeologists have recovered tens of thousands of these tablets over the past century and a half, with many still awaiting translation in museum storage rooms around the world. And among these recovered texts are compositions that modern scholars call the Sumerian King List, the Eridu Genesis, the Enuma Elish, and various other mythological and historical documents that together paint a picture of Sumerian cosmology and their understanding of prehistory. And what makes these texts so fascinating is that the Sumerians themselves distinguished between mythological time and historical time, keeping separate records for what they called the period before the flood and the period after, suggesting that even 5,000 years ago people were wrestling with questions about deep time and the origins of civilization. Now, mainstream Sumerian scholarship, led by scholars like Samuel Noah Kramer and Thorkild Jacobson, has established that these texts represent a sophisticated mythology that reflected Sumerian social structures, religious beliefs, and attempts to understand the natural world, with the Anunnaki representing a pantheon of deities associated with sky, earth, and underworld. And Kramer, who spent decades translating Sumerian tablets at the University of Pennsylvania, famously called Sumer the cradle of civilization, and demonstrated how many later Mesopotamian myths derived from earlier Sumerian originals, which is itself remarkable because it means the stories we're exploring tonight are the ancestors of countless myths that came after, including stories that would eventually influence biblical narratives and Greek mythology. So when you hear about the Anunnaki tonight, you're hearing echoes of characters and concepts that would ripple forward through human culture for millennia. But here's where things get wonderfully weird, and I say wonderfully because part of the joy of these nighttime explorations is allowing ourselves to consider the stranger interpretations that exist on the fringes of scholarship. And since the 1970s, a whole school of thought has emerged, suggesting that these Sumerian texts might be recording something other than pure mythology, with writers like Zecharia Sitchin proposing that the Anunnaki were actually extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru, who came to Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago. And while mainstream academics dismiss this interpretation as pseudo-history based on faulty translations and creative extrapolation, there's something almost cozy about considering these ideas late at night, not because they're likely true, but because they remind us how much mystery still surrounds these ancient texts, and how many different ways humans have tried to make sense of them. And honestly, the ancient Sumerians would probably appreciate the ongoing debate, given how much they loved a good story, though they might be confused by the concept of alien spacecraft, which would have been a tough sell to someone whose most advanced transportation technology was a wheeled cart pulled by onagers. And speaking of carts, can you imagine explaining a flying saucer to someone from ancient Ur? because that conversation would get complicated fast, probably involving a lot of pointing at the sky and frustrated hand gestures. The Sumerian accounts of the pre-human age begin with descriptions of the earth in its primordial state, and the texts describe a world without cities, without cultivated fields, without the canals and irrigation systems that would later make Sumerian civilization possible, a wild earth where the gods themselves had to labor to make the land habitable. And these descriptions are actually quite beautiful in their original Sumerian, with phrases that scholars translate in various ways, but that generally convey a sense of raw, untamed nature gradually being shaped by divine intervention. And there's a scholarly debate that's been ongoing since at least the 1960s about whether these primordial descriptions reflect Sumerian memories of actual environmental changes in Mesopotamia, perhaps echoing the end of the last ice age when sea levels rose and the Persian Gulf flooded the lower Tigris-Euphrates Valley, or whether they're purely mythological constructions meant to emphasize the importance of civilization and the gods who supposedly made it possible. And scholars like Harriet Crawford and J.N. Postgate have written extensively about the relationship between Sumerian mythology and the actual environmental history of Mesopotamia, noting that some mythological details do seem to correspond with geological evidence, which is either a remarkable coincidence or suggests that the Sumerians were preserving genuine memories of their landscape's transformation, albeit dressed in the clothing of divine narrative. As you lie there listening, maybe feeling your breath beginning to slow and your thoughts becoming softer around the edges, it's worth noting that the Sumerian scribes who recorded these stories were essentially the information technology specialists of their age, spending years learning the complex cuneiform writing system, which involved memorizing hundreds of signs and their various meanings. And these scribes sat cross-legged in temple schools called edubas, or tablet houses, practicing their craft on recycled clay, while their teachers, called umiyas, watched over their shoulders, probably making the same kinds of exasperated sighing sounds that teachers have made throughout human history when students make obvious mistakes. And one actually wonders if those ancient teachers ever said things like, "I've explained this 100 times," or "Did you even do the reading?" Because some experiences seem truly universal, and the relationship between frustrated teachers, distracted students probably predates even Sumer, stretching back to whenever the first elder tried to teach the first young person anything at all, which might have been in a cave somewhere with the lesson involving which berries were safe to eat, a topic with much higher stakes than cuneiform grammar. The temples where these tablets were stored were themselves remarkable structures, ziggurats that rose in stepped terraces toward the sky, and the largest of these, like the ziggurat at Ur, would have been visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain, serving as both religious centers and administrative hubs, and it was in these complexes that priests and scribes maintained the records of both earthly transactions and divine histories, because to the Sumerians, there was no clear separation between the sacred and the mundane, between the business of temples and the stories of the gods. It all existed on a continuum of meaning and importance, which is actually a rather sensible approach to life if you think about it. And maybe modern society would be slightly less stressed if we could integrate our spiritual and practical lives as seamlessly as the Sumerians did, though admittedly their spiritual life involved animal sacrifice and reading sheep livers for omens, which might not translate perfectly to the modern office environment, and HR would definitely have some concerns about the sheep liver thing, not to mention the building maintenance staff. The texts we're exploring tonight, particularly those dealing with the period before humans, describe the Anunnaki as a group of powerful beings, usually numbering 50 or so great gods, with many lesser divine beings serving under them. And the word Anunnaki itself has been translated various ways, with the most common scholarly interpretation being something like those of royal blood, or princely offspring, referring to their descent from the sky god An, who was considered the father of the gods. And these Anunnaki were not abstract concepts or distant forces, but were described as having bodies, emotions, needs, and conflicts. They grew tired, they argued, they made decisions in councils, they had hierarchies and specialties, with some overseeing the heavens, others the earth, and still others the underworld. And this detailed characterization is part of what makes Sumerian mythology so rich and so different from some later monotheistic traditions, because these gods were fundamentally relatable, even in their divine power. They experienced frustration and relief, ambition and exhaustion, and tonight as we continue, you'll hear how these very human characteristics of the divine beings supposedly led to the most consequential decision in Earth's prehistory. The Sumerian texts describe the early Anunnaki as beings who arrived on Earth with a purpose, And while modern scholars interpret this mythologically, the ancient scribes recorded it as a kind of corporate mission statement from the heavens, because the Anunnaki, according to these accounts, came to Earth to extract resources and to shape the wild landscape into something more suitable for their divine projects, and the texts describe them laboring across impossibly long periods of time, with the Sumerian king list recording reigns of individual rulers lasting tens of thousands of years before the flood, numbers so large that some scholars believe they must be using a different calendrical system or recording dynasties rather than individual reigns, while others suggest these numbers are purely symbolic, meant to convey the vast antiquity of the pre-flood era rather than actual chronology. And this debate about the meaning of these immense time spans has been ongoing since the king list was first translated in the early 20th century, with scholars like Jacobson suggesting the numbers might reflect astronomical cycles or mathematical symbolism embedded in Sumerian sacred numerology, while fringe interpreters take them more literally, suggesting they describe beings with genuinely extended lifespans. And either way, the effect is the same for us tonight. A sense of time stretching backward into an almost incomprehensible depth, like looking down into a canyon and feeling slightly dizzy at the scale of what you're seeing. The labor of the Anunnaki in these primordial accounts is described in surprisingly mundane terms, and this is one of the genuinely fascinating aspects of Sumerian mythology that mainstream scholars have noted, because rather than the gods creating the world through pure thought or magical incantation, the texts describe them physically digging canals, piling up earth, clearing marshes, and building structures, work that sounds less like divine creation and more like an infrastructure project. And the eminent Sumerologist Bent Ulster has written about how this portrayal of divine labor reflects Sumerian society's emphasis on irrigation and land management, because for a civilization that depended entirely on controlling the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates, the most godlike action imaginable was probably digging a really good canal. Which makes sense when you think about it, though it does somewhat diminish the cosmic grandeur of divine beings, if you imagine them basically running an ancient construction company, probably with all the same problems of any large project, like scheduling conflicts, material shortages, and at least one supervisor who insists on micromanaging everything, despite not actually understanding how the work gets done, because some workplace dynamics are apparently eternal, and possibly even divine. The fringe interpretation of these labor passages goes in a very different direction, suggesting that the Anunnaki were using advanced technology to terraform the planet, and proponents of this view point to texts that mention the gods using tools and implements that the scribes described in terms of their own technology, but which might, according to this reading, represent something far more advanced. And while there's absolutely no mainstream scholarly support for this interpretation, it's entertaining to consider on a sleepy night like tonight, imagining ancient beings reshaping coastlines and redirecting rivers with technologies we can barely conceptualize. And the nice thing about late-night speculation is that you don't have to commit to anything. You can simply enjoy the idea and then let it dissolve like morning fog when the more rigorous light of day arrives. And speaking of fog, the Mesopotamian climate was actually quite different in the Sumerian period than it is today, with more rainfall and more extensive wetlands. And some scholars believe the Garden of Eden story, which appears in later texts but may have Sumerian origins, is essentially a memory of this lusher period, a time when the land between the rivers was genuinely paradise-like compared to the harsher desert conditions that would develop later. So perhaps what the ancient scribes were describing wasn't divine terraforming at all, but rather their own ancestors' memories of a climate transition that happened over centuries, which is arguably just as remarkable as any extraterrestrial explanation, and has the added benefit of being scientifically plausible. As you settle deeper into your pillow and feel the day's tension continuing to release from your shoulders and your jaw, and that spot between your eyebrows where stress likes to accumulate like dust in a forgotten corner, consider that the Sumerians themselves recognized different categories of divine beings within their mythology, and the Anunnaki were distinct from other supernatural entities like the Ajigi, who were often described as lesser gods or servant deities. And this hierarchical structure is important because the texts describe a growing tension between these groups, with the Ajigi performing much of the actual labor under Anunnaki supervision. And if this sounds like a familiar workplace dynamic, that's because the Sumerians were apparently projecting their own social structures onto their mythology, with the divine realm mirroring the earthly realm where the temple administrators supervised the workers who actually built and maintained the irrigation systems. And there's something almost comforting about this. The idea that humans have always tried to understand the cosmic order by looking at what they knew from their own experience, even if that means imagining the gods as essentially celestial middle managers, which is probably not the most flattering portrait of divinity ever conceived, but does have a certain honest realism to it. And you have to admire a culture that didn't pretend their gods were above organizational politics. The Sumerian conception of time before humans is particularly interesting because it seems to blend what we would now separate as myth and history, and the scribes recorded these pre-human periods in the same matter-of-fact style they used for recording grain distributions and temple offerings, suggesting that to them, the age of the gods was as real and concrete as the age of human kings, just farther back and harder to access, and scholars have debated whether the Sumerians actually believed these accounts literally, or whether they understood them as a kind of sacred literature that conveyed truth through story rather than factual chronicle. And this is a question we can never fully answer, because we can't interview a Sumerian scribe about their epistemology, though if we could, they would probably be more interested in asking us questions, like why we haven't properly maintained the Temple of Enlil, and whether we've been keeping up with the appropriate sacrifices, because, from their perspective, the decline of proper religious observance would explain a lot about the state of the modern world. And honestly, they might have a point, not about the sacrifices specifically, but about the general principle that societies function better when people feel connected to something larger than themselves. And maybe the Sumerians understood something important that we've forgotten. Or maybe I'm getting philosophical because it's late, and ancient stories have a way of making you think about big questions, which is either wonderful or slightly annoying, depending on whether you're trying to fall asleep. The landscape that the Anunnaki supposedly shaped in these primordial accounts was genuinely challenging territory, because southern Mesopotamia in its natural state was a vast marsh system where the rivers deposited silt, and the land was constantly shifting between water and earth, and making this land suitable for agriculture required exactly the kind of intensive canal digging and water management that the texts attribute to the gods, and archaeological evidence shows that the earliest Sumerian settlements emerged in this environment around 6,000 years ago, though there may have been earlier communities in areas now submerged beneath the Persian Gulf, and this possibility of lost settlements beneath the waters has fueled some of the more speculative theories about Sumerian prehistory, with some researchers suggesting that a more advanced culture might have existed before the historical Sumerians, a culture that was destroyed or displaced when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. And while mainstream archaeology doesn't support the existence of such an advanced precursor civilization, the idea persists in popular imagination, and it's worth noting that the Persian Gulf has risen significantly over the past 15,000 years, meaning there genuinely are archaeological sites now underwater that might contain surprises, though probably not the kind of surprises that involve ancient astronauts or lost technologies, more likely the kind that involve really old pottery fragments and the scattered remains of fishing villages, which is less dramatic, but honestly just as interesting, if you have the right mindset. And speaking of mindsets, I hope yours is getting nice and drowsy, because that's the goal here, not to stimulate your brain with excitement, but to wrap it in a soft blanket of ancient narrative that lets it slowly power down like a computer entering sleep mode, except without the annoying fans and the worry that your updates haven't been properly installed. The scholarly debate about Sumerian mythology's relationship to actual history continues to evolve as new tablets are translated and new archaeological sites are excavated, and one particularly interesting recent discussion has centered on the question of whether Sumerian myths preserve memories of astronomical events, with some scholars suggesting that descriptions of divine battles and cosmic catastrophes might encode observations of meteor impacts, eclipses, or other celestial phenomena that would have seemed profoundly meaningful to ancient observers, and this archaeoastronomy approach has gained some mainstream acceptance for certain specific texts, while remaining controversial for others. And the nice thing about these debates is that they keep the ancient past feeling alive and relevant, not a closed book, but an ongoing conversation between the present and the deep past. And you can participate in this conversation simply by listening to these stories and thinking about them, which is exactly what you're doing right now, even if thinking is becoming increasingly optional as sleep begins to tug at the edges of your consciousness. The duration of the Anunnaki's earthly presence before humans, according to these ancient accounts, stretched across what the texts describe as sars and nurs, Sumerian units of time that represent 3,600 and 600 years respectively, and the calculations based on the Sumerian king list suggest a pre-flood period of several 100,000 years, numbers so vast that they resist easy comprehension, like trying to visualize the distance to a star or the number of neurons in a human brain, and whether these numbers are literal symbolic, or the product of some calendrical system we don't fully understand. Their effect is to create a sense of profound antiquity, of a prehistory so deep that human existence represents only the most recent moment, a thin layer atop an impossibly thick cake of divine activity. And that's actually not a bad metaphor for how geologists think about Earth history too, with human civilization representing the very top of a stratigraphic column that stretches down through millions and billions of years of prior existence. So maybe the Sumerians were onto something. Maybe their mythological sense of deep time was actually more accurate than the compressed timeline that many cultures developed later. And there's a kind of wisdom in acknowledging that the world existed long before us and was presumably doing just fine, which is either humbling or slightly insulting depending on how central you like to feel to the cosmic narrative. The texts describe a pivotal moment in the cosmic timeline, a moment when the divine labor that had shaped the primordial earth became unbearable, and the Igigi, those lesser gods who had been doing the actual work under Anunnaki supervision, began to complain and eventually to rebel against their endless toil. And this divine labor strike, if we can call it that, is recorded in several Sumerian and later Babylonian texts, most notably the Atrahasis epic, which describes the Igigi's grievances in terms that any overworked employee would recognize. They were tired, they were resentful, and they had had enough of digging canals and maintaining irrigation systems for thousands upon thousands of years with no end in sight. And there's something almost touchingly modern about this ancient narrative, this idea that even gods can burn out, that even divine beings have limits to their patience and their willingness to labor for someone else's benefit. And if you've ever felt exhausted by work that seemed to have no end, you might find a strange kinship with these ancient divine workers. Though admittedly your commute probably doesn't involve descending from the heavens, and your break room likely has better refreshments than whatever the Igigi had access to, which the texts don't actually specify, but which I imagine was probably disappointing, because divine break rooms in every mythology seem to involve either ambrosia or nothing at all, with no practical options like a decent coffee machine. The mainstream scholarly interpretation of this divine labor narrative, articulated by scholars like W.G. Tual, Lambert and John Botero, sees it as a mythological exploration of questions about work, hierarchy, and the origin of human purpose, with the Sumerian priests essentially using the story to explain why humans exist and what their role in the cosmic order should be, because the solution that the gods devise for the labor problem involves creating humanity to take over the work, which provides a neat mythological justification for the fact that Sumerian commoners spent their lives laboring to support the temple complexes and their priestly administrators. And Lambert's critical edition and translation of the Atrahasis epic, published in 1969, remains the standard scholarly reference for this text, though subsequent discoveries and translations have added nuance to our understanding of the narrative, and the debate continues about exactly how to interpret the theological implications of humans being created as divine replacement workers, because on one hand, it's a rather unflattering origin story, but on the other hand, it does give human labor a kind of cosmic significance, suggesting that by working the fields and maintaining the canals, ordinary Sumerians were literally doing the work of the gods, which is either inspiring or depressing, depending on how you feel about your own job. The fringe interpretation of this divine counsel and the decision to create humanity goes in predictably creative directions, with writers like Sitchin suggesting that the Anunnaki needed workers for their mining operations and used advanced genetic engineering to create humans from existing primates, a theory that requires ignoring pretty much everything we know about genetics, evolution, and ancient languages, but which has nonetheless attracted a significant popular following. And there's something interesting about why this interpretation appeals to people, because it offers an alternative to both religious creation narratives and scientific evolution, a third option that feels both ancient and technological, both spiritual and materialistic. And while I wouldn't recommend building your worldview on it, it does remind us that humans have always been creative in their attempts to explain where they came from, and the ancient Sumerians would probably appreciate the irony that their texts, created to explain the world to their own culture, are now being used to explain it in entirely different ways to cultures they never imagined, though they would definitely be confused by the spacecraft angle, and someone would have to explain to them what genetics is before they could even begin to evaluate the theory, and that explanation would probably require several additional explanations, like what cells are, and what DNA is, and why we're no longer sacrificing sheep to ensure good harvests, at which point they might just give up and ask to go home, assuming home still exists after several thousand years, which it doesn't, which would be another difficult conversation. The Council of the Gods, as described in these texts, is a wonderfully detailed affair, with various deities presenting arguments and counter-arguments, voicing concerns and proposing solutions, and the god Enlil, who served as a kind of chief executive among the Anunnaki, presides over these deliberations, with what the texts describe as a combination of authority and occasionally visible frustration, because even divine councils apparently involve the kinds of procedural delays and competing interests that make any committee work challenging, and there's a scholarly debate about whether this council mythology reflects actual Sumerian political practices, with some scholars suggesting that the divine assembly mirrors the assemblies of elders that governed early Sumerian cities, while others see it as a more abstract representation of cosmic order, and this debate connects to larger questions about the relationship between mythology and society, about whether religions shape culture or reflect it, or some complex combination of both, questions that scholars have been arguing about for centuries, and will probably continue arguing about for centuries more, which is fine because academic debate, like divine council meetings, is apparently an eternal feature of any organized intellectual community. As you lie there, perhaps feeling your limbs getting heavier, and your thoughts getting softer and more diffuse, like watercolors bleeding into wet paper, the ancient story continues with the decision to create humanity, and the process described in these texts is remarkably specific, involving the sacrifice of a god whose blood and flesh are mixed with clay to create the first humans, a narrative that carries deep theological significance about the divine spark within humanity and our fundamental connection to the gods, and the god who is sacrificed in the Atrahasis version is described as having temu, a word that scholars translate variously as reason, understanding, or planning capacity, suggesting that humanity's rational faculty is literally divine in origin, which is a rather beautiful idea regardless of its literal truth, and it connects to similar concepts in other mythologies, including the Greek idea of Prometheus and fire, and the biblical notion of humans being created in God's image, as if every culture that has thought deeply about human nature has concluded that there's something fundamentally special about human consciousness, something that links us to whatever forces created and govern the universe, and whether you interpret this religiously, philosophically, or simply poetically, it's a comforting thought to carry into sleep, this ancient notion that your mind, with all its quirks and worries and dreams, contains something genuinely precious, something the ancient Sumerians believed came from the gods themselves. The creation of the first humans in these accounts involves a goddess named Nintu, or Ninhursag, the great mother goddess associated with birth and creation, and she works alongside the wise god Enki, whose cunning and intelligence make him the natural choice for any project requiring technical skill, and the collaboration between these deities produces the first 7 pairs of humans, who are then put to work immediately, taking over the labor that the Ajigi had abandoned, and the texts describe this transition with what almost sounds like relief, as if the cosmic order has been restored through this creative solution to the labor problem, and human history, such as it is, can finally begin, though from the Sumerian perspective, we're still very much in the mythological period, with actual recorded history beginning only after the flood that lies ahead in the narrative. And speaking of lying, I hope you're doing exactly that right now, lying down comfortably with nothing to do but listen and drift, and let these ancient stories carry you towards sleep, because that's the whole point of these nighttime journeys, not to inform or educate in any urgent way, but simply to provide a gentle current of words that your mind can float upon as it makes its way toward rest. The scholarly consensus on the Sumerian creation accounts emphasizes their function within Sumerian religion and society, but there's also recognition that these stories wrestle with genuinely profound questions about human existence, purpose, and meaning, questions that remain relevant today despite all our technological and scientific advances, and perhaps that's why these ancient texts continue to fascinate people, not because they provide answers, but because they show that humans have been asking the same questions for thousands of years, finding comfort in stories that give shape and significance to the mysterious fact of existence, and the Sumerian scribes who recorded these narratives were participating in a tradition that extends both backward and forward in time, backward to the oral traditions that preceded writing, and forward to us, lying in our beds thousands of years later, still wondering where we came from, and what it all means, and if that shared wondering creates a kind of connection across the millennia, then these ancient texts have achieved something remarkable, bridging an almost inconceivable gap of time through nothing more than words pressed into clay and eventually translated into sounds that now fill your ears as sleep approaches. And honestly, That's a pretty impressive accomplishment for some old tablets, though if the tablets could comment, they would probably be more concerned about their storage conditions and whether the museum humidity levels are properly maintained, because clay tablets have priorities that don't include philosophical reflections on their cultural legacy. The Sumerian accounts of the age before humanity do not end with the creation of humans, because the ancient texts describe a long period of coexistence between the newly created humans and their divine creators, a period during which the world was governed differently than it would be after the Great Flood, with the gods dwelling in their temple complexes and humans serving them directly, and the Sumerian king list records this pre-flood period as a time of impossibly long reigns, with kings ruling for tens of thousands of years, a detail that has generated endless scholarly debate about whether these numbers represent actual chronology, symbolic values, astronomical calculations, or simply scribal conventions that we don't fully understand, and the consensus among mainstream scholars like Jean-Jacques Glasner, who has written extensively on Mesopotamian historiography, is that these numbers function differently than modern historical dates, conveying antiquity, authority rather than precise temporal measurement. But the exact mechanism by which the Sumerians calculated or constructed these numbers remains disputed, and tablets continue to be analyzed using various mathematical approaches to see if any consistent system underlies the seemingly arbitrary values. A detective work that spans millennia and involves specialists in ancient mathematics, astronomy, and philology, all contributing their expertise to a puzzle that may never be fully solved. The pre-flood civilization described in these texts is presented as sophisticated and organized, with cities and temples already established, and the list of antediluvian kings mentions 5 cities specifically: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, with kingship passing from city to city according to divine decree. And this detail is particularly interesting because some of these cities are archaeologically attested, with Eridu in particular showing evidence of extremely early habitation stretching back before 5000 BCE, making it a candidate for one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in the world. And the Sumerian claim that kingship descended from heaven to Eridu first connects mythology to a real place, blurring the line between myth and history in a way that makes these texts so fascinating and so difficult to interpret, because we can stand in the ruins of Eridu today and know that something happened here, that people lived and worked and presumably told stories about the gods long before any tablets were written. But whether those stories resembled the later recorded mythology or were something entirely different, we can never know. And there's a productive scholarly debate about how much weight to give the historical elements in these mythological texts, with some scholars treating them as potentially preserving genuine memories, while others see them as later constructions projected backward onto a legendary past. The fringe interpretation of the pre-flood civilization goes considerably further, suggesting that this was a period of advanced technology and perhaps genetic manipulation, with the Anunnaki overseeing human development through means that the ancient scribes could only describe in the language available to them. And while this interpretation has no mainstream scholarly support, it does highlight something genuinely interesting about these texts, namely the consistent Sumerian belief that the world before the flood was fundamentally different from the world after, a belief shared with many other flood traditions around the world, and suggesting either that flood myths spread from a common source, that separate cultures independently experienced flooding catastrophes that shaped their mythologies, or that something about the human psyche finds the flood narrative compelling, regardless of historical basis. And all of these possibilities have their advocates in the scholarly literature, with the question of flood myth origins remaining an active area of research in comparative mythology and folklore studies. And speaking of floods, I hope you're not experiencing any floods of anxious thoughts right now, because the whole point of this exercise is to help you set down the weight of thinking and simply drift like a leaf on a slow-moving river, except that metaphor might be too flood-adjacent given our current topic, so maybe more like a feather floating through still air, gently and aimlessly, and without any particular destination, just floating because that's what feathers do when given the chance, and what you should do right now if you can manage it. The Great Flood itself, when it comes in these narratives, is presented as a divine decision to destroy humanity, with different texts offering different reasons for this catastrophic choice, and one of the most commonly cited reasons is that humans had become too numerous and too noisy, disturbing the gods' rest with their constant clamor, which is actually a wonderful detail because it suggests that divine beings suffer from the same noise sensitivity that some of us experience, and there's something almost sympathetic about imagining the great god Enlil lying awake at night, unable to sleep because of all the human activity going on below, eventually becoming so frustrated that he decides to just flood the whole thing and get some peace, which is an extreme response to noise pollution but perhaps understandable after tens of thousands of years of it. And if you've ever lived in an apartment with loud neighbors, you might feel a tiny spark of sympathy for Enlil. Though, hopefully, your coping mechanisms are less apocalyptic than his, and your building has a working noise complaint system, which ancient Sumer apparently lacked. The flood narrative in Sumerian mythology follows a pattern that will be familiar to anyone who knows the biblical flood story or other Near Eastern flood traditions, with a righteous individual being warned by a sympathetic god and instructed to build a vessel to survive the coming deluge. And in the Sumerian version, this individual is Ziusudra, whose name means life of long days, while in the later Akkadian and Babylonian versions, he's called Utnapishtim or Atrahasis, and the parallels between these flood stories and the biblical Noah account have fascinated scholars since the first Mesopotamian flood tablets were translated in the 19th century, with George Smith's 1872 discovery and translation of the flood account in the Epic of Gilgamesh, causing a sensation in Victorian England because it so closely resembled the biblical story while predating it by perhaps 1,000 years, and this discovery sparked a debate that continues today about the relationship between Mesopotamian and biblical literature, with most scholars now accepting that the Hebrew flood account was influenced by earlier Mesopotamian traditions, though the exact mechanism of transmission and the theological differences between the accounts remain subjects of scholarly discussion, and the mainstream view, articulated by scholars like Jeffrey Tigay and Israel Finkelstein, is that the biblical authors knew and adapted Mesopotamian traditions, adding their own distinctive theological emphases to received material. As you listen to the story of the ancient flood, perhaps feeling your own consciousness becoming more fluid and diffuse, ready to wash away the sharp edges of the day and leave something softer in their place, consider that the Sumerian understanding of this catastrophe was complex and multi-layered, not simply a punishment, but a kind of cosmic reset, after which the world would operate by different rules, with human lifespans shortened and the direct interaction between gods and humans becoming less frequent. And this is actually a common pattern in world mythology, this idea of a golden age, followed by catastrophe, followed by our current diminished state, as if every culture has independently concluded that things used to be better somehow, that our ancestors had access to something we've lost, whether divine presence or natural abundance, or simply longer lives, and there's probably some truth to this at various points in history, given the cyclical nature of civilization, and the real losses that can occur when empires collapse or environments change. But there's also probably something psychological about it, a tendency to project our dissatisfactions backward onto an imaginary past, where everything was supposedly better, and the Sumerians would probably be amused to know that people still do this 5,000 years later, still looking backward for a lost paradise, while largely ignoring the real improvements in things like medicine, sanitation, and the availability of comfortable bedding, which the ancient Sumerians definitely did not have in the form you're enjoying right now, because reed mats on mud brick floors are considerably less cozy than whatever you're currently lying on, and that's actually worth appreciating, this small privilege of physical comfort that would have seemed almost miraculous to the ancient scribes who recorded these stories. The aftermath of the flood in Sumerian mythology involves the re-establishment of kingship and civilization, now operating on a more recognizably human scale, and the Sumerian king list transitions from the impossibly long reigns of the pre-flood period to still impressive, but somewhat more believable reign lengths after the flood. And this transition marks the beginning of what the Sumerians considered their actual history, the period when human affairs proceeded according to patterns they could recognize and record. And it's fitting that our journey tonight has brought us to this boundary, this moment when myth shades into something more like history, because that boundary is exactly where the strangeness of the ancient past meets the familiar patterns of human existence, the eternal cycles of civilization and conflict, growth and decline, that have characterized human experience ever since. And as sleep approaches, maybe you can feel yourself at a similar boundary, the threshold between waking and sleeping, between conscious thought and the flowing strangeness of dreams. And there's no need to resist that transition, no need to hold on to alertness any longer. You can let yourself drift across that boundary, just as the ancient world drifted from the age of gods to the age of men, a natural and inevitable progression that requires nothing more than letting go. And so we arrive at the end of our journey tonight, having traveled back through thousands of years of human memory to the very edge of what the ancient Sumerians believed they knew about the world before humanity. And perhaps what strikes me most about these ancient accounts is how seriously the scribes took them. pressing their reed styluses into clay with the same careful attention they gave to recording grain shipments and temple offerings, because to them, these stories of the Anunnaki and the age before humans were not entertainment or speculation, but essential knowledge about the nature of reality. And maybe there's something we can learn from that seriousness, not necessarily to believe exactly what they believed, but to approach the big questions of existence with genuine attention and care, to wonder about where we came from and what it all means, and to find those questions worthy of our best efforts. And as you lie there now, hopefully feeling the gentle weight of approaching sleep pressing on your eyelids and softening your thoughts, you carry within you the same capacity for wonder that those ancient scribes had, the same curious spark that led them to record these stories and led you to listen to them tonight. And that continuity across millennia is itself a kind of miracle, a thread of human consciousness stretching from temple schools in ancient Sumer to your bedroom wherever you are in the world, connected by nothing more than the persistent human desire to understand and to tell stories about what we think we know. The Sumerian texts we've explored tonight will continue to be studied and debated. New translations will emerge, and old interpretations will be revised, but the core mystery will remain. This record of a time before time that the ancients believed in so deeply, and whether you think of it as mythology, distorted history, or something else entirely, it has accompanied you through this evening, and hopefully helped ease you toward rest. And that's really all any story can hope to do, to take you somewhere for a while, and then return you, slightly changed perhaps, to wherever you need to be. And right now, you need to be asleep, so let these final words carry you there, like a boat drifting on still water under ancient stars. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe and maybe leave a comment about what you'd like to explore in future episodes, but that can wait until tomorrow, because right now your only task is to let go, to release the grip of waking consciousness and trust that sleep will catch you, as it has every night of your life, as it caught the ancient Sumerians when they finally set down their styluses and left their tablets to dry in the Mesopotamian sun. And perhaps they dreamed of the gods they wrote about, those powerful beings who shaped the world before humans walked upon it. And perhaps tonight you'll dream of them too, or of the mud brick cities and stepped ziggurats and the endless sky above the flat river plain, or of nothing at all, just peaceful darkness and rest, which is honestly the best outcome and the one I hope for you. The night is here, the story is complete, the ancient words have been spoken, and we'll wait patiently for the next person who wants to hear them. Because that's what stories do, they wait, and while they wait, you sleep, drifting through the hours until morning comes and the world begins again. And until then, sweet dreams and good night. End of script. Sweet dreams.